We are committed to creating a safe and supportive space for our guests and listeners, and to provide information and tools that will help our listeners understand, manage, and overcome trauma. We understand that the healing journey can bring up challenging emotions. Therefore, we want to warn our audience that certain episodes may contain discussions or stories that could be triggering for some individuals. The content of the podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and we encourage you to practice self-care and discretion while listening, and to reach out to a trusted support system or professional if you feel overwhelmed and need help on your healing journey. Well, Susan, welcome, and thank you so much for being on my podcast today.
Lisa, it's thrilling to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the content that you're producing for your listeners.
Oh, you know what? And it's having guests like you on that, we're just spreading the love, we're spreading the word, and that's what it's all about, seeing who, my whole thing is shorten people's suffering, right?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd like to go out of business, actually. Meaning, I've said that before, when I used to do the workshop, I wish we would go out of business, I would love that. Spend our energy on more positive, things. But anyway, so I wanted to start off, and I wanted to give the title of your book, because as I was mentioning before we got started, that I really love the title of your book because it's kind of all encompassing and leaves you with a lot of hope. And so the name of your book is Toxic Family: Transforming Childhood Trauma into Adult Freedom. Freedom was my word last year.
Oh, Lisa, yeah, I'm glad we're holding the theme in this year. So that actually was not my full title. It was probably 2 weeks before the book was to be published, and my publisher called and she said, by the way, how do you feel about changing the title from Magical Illumination to Toxic Family? It's like it sent me into such tizzy, because I have great love for my family, and I feel that my journey through this and my journey of awakening and facing what I've lived through and hopefully helping others to do the same has been magical, and it has been a brilliant illumination. So much light and love has been revealed as a result of this walk, primarily feeling that my family members have played their roles to the T, and their ancestors, my maternal and paternal grandparents and their parents, and so on and so on, right, back through the lineage, all played their roles to a T. My parents came from horrific abuse. And
as did mine. Mine did too.
When did you discover it, Lisa?
I knew with my dad, I kind of knew it all along, because he told me that when I was young, that he left his father at 14, left his family at 14 because his father was so abusive with him. And he actually lived as a hobo, he called himself, for years, lived on the railways. My mom, I didn't realize it until about 2.5 years ago, when I was trying to figure out her history, because I was on ancestry and I couldn't figure it out. It would not, wouldn't go back in time on her. And so with the help of a friend, we discovered a lot about my mom, and it clearly spoke out that she lived in a very unstable environment and likely a lot of abuse. My grandmother had lots of babies and lots of marriages.
Yeah.
She was the oldest. My mom was the oldest.
And same with me. My mother, it was just horrific. She could be so loving and nurturing and genuine, and then for no reason at all, she would flip and be beating me almost to the point where I'd lose consciousness, and I didn't know why. And she was self-soothing with food, and back then the answer was diet pills. And back then, diet pills were straight speed. So my father was soothing his woes with alcohol. The whiskey bottle would uncork at 7:30 a.m. And he's a genius astrophysicist. And off he'd go on his bike to campus. And he'd always be 3 sheets to the wind. I didn't understand what a drunk was until much later. And my mother also, the soothing was with diet pills. So there I was being raised by an alcoholic and a pillhead who had a
Mm-hmm.
mental health issue. And I was in my 20s before I really pieced it. I could get sensations because I was quite empathic and highly telepathic until it became too dangerous. I could read thoughts and
Mm.
definitely read energies in the room, and it would keep me safe. I would know how to respond, but it also kept me on hyper alert and
Oh
my
yeah.
central nervous system on overdrive. And I just dreamed of getting out. And I did the morning after my high school graduation. It was on a Friday night, and Saturday morning at 7:45 at 17, I left. But I realized growing up, my mother must have had horrible abuse. I would get these flashes of her being pursued, and she was always so adamant about don't talk to strangers, don't let anyone touch you, if don't do it. And it was in my 20s that I put it all together. She had been molested by the parish priest. Her own father was beaten to almost to the point of death by his stepmother. He had a loving mother who died, and his father remarried quickly. And this woman was brutal. So he, in his own marriage, would not let his wife show affection to their two children, my mother being one.
Mm.
And the same abuse that he experienced was foisted on my mother. These psychopathic outbursts and beatings, and she was expected to remain quiet. And I believe he may have been schizophrenic as a result of all he experienced, and that my mother was facing the same. It was the only thing that I could string together for the
Mm-hmm.
type of abuse and mental state. So, but I understood that it was hurt and abused children, Lisa,
Yeah.
raising hurt and abused children. And I had a choice. And when I saw the same red flags, rising in my own life, I too, at 25, took a slug out of a wine jug to ask for a raise at work. I was like, this feels like just like my dad,
Mm-hmm.
I had to have a drink if there was going to be a social occasion. And I wasn't drinking for taste and experience. I was drinking to get out of the horrendous sense of self that I felt. I felt completely unworthy. I was
Mm.
I was a chameleon. I would be whomever I projected you wanted me to be, because that was a
Yes.
tool I had learned early on to
I
stay
did too.
safe. Yeah.
That's
So it,
interesting you say that because that's exactly what I used to do.
and many of us do, and we keep it silent. I didn't understand it until I got clean and started to go to some of those meetings with A's to learn about my father's drinking problem, and then realized I had my own, and then also learned about how being raised with addiction in a household affects you as a child. And these secrets were being told out loud, spoken in a room by a small group of us who had experienced the same upbringing. And by identifying, maybe not so much with specifics, but by the feelings,
Mm-hmm.
um, I realized, oh, yeah, me too. Me too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And so in saying all this, which is a great prelude to really what your book is about too, is, and I love this, leaving the shame and guilt of a toxic family lines. And so breaking basically like the generational childhood abuse that is passed down, which, and I think so much of that too comes from, even when I was a child, abuse wasn't talked about, and there certainly wasn't anything there to protect children at my age. There wasn't anything in place until like the 80s, even the 90s, that protected children. And so I think even with our parents, like the horrific stuff that your parents went through, and mine too, like that was just normal for a lot of families. And the word childhood abuse, or the words childhood abuse, wasn't never brought up. It was really expected. to live like that, and children to be seen and not heard, and they weren't respected. And so, I think that kind of set the tone for a lot of abuse. And it is until, now that we're really seeing the repercussions of that, and that it does get passed down, because there's probably a lot of reasons, but one that comes up is that's what we're raised with. That's what we know.
And I want to say that it's not just endemic to the family system, but it's also the other outdated patriarchal systems that we're seeing fall in front of us, the education system.
Oh, yeah.
The governmental system, the corporate structure, all of that, it all comes into play. But not to digress, I'll go back to the toxic family. And
you do have a very good point, though. And I see exactly where you're going with that. And you are right. I'm in agreement.
So for me, I've had an amazing career. I went on to New York from that household to match celebrities to brands in New York. And that led me into producing for television and film, and ultimately out to LA. And like a very glittering experience, and one that was highly successful. But here I am, Lisa, finally knowing my authentic purpose and reason of being here. And that's to create conversation around such a taboo topic, so we can release these bags of shame and abuse and guilt and violence and toxicity that don't even belong to us, that we're still carrying.
That were put upon us. And we had to live with the consequences of that.
Which were many, and they still reverberate. I mean, I can't tell you how many therapeutic modalities I've experienced. I mean, for me, getting clean and sober was just the ground floor, the basic template for me to be able to do the work that I would need to do to find freedom and to find authentic happiness. And believe me, it feels like it's been a decade by decade process. There was the decade of getting clean and sober. There was the decade of clinical depression and finally coming to terms and understanding the suicidal ideation that I struggled with since I was 6 years old. It's the prelude to the book is my first experience. But anyway, yeah, clinical depression and realizing the signs and how to work with it. And then ultimately the perfect storm was really confronting narcissistic abuse to the core of my being. And that was the billboard it took to fall on my head to wake me up completely.
Was that a relationship you were in?
Oh my goodness. So I thought, Lisa, I went from New York to LA for a career move. And I did, but really what I did was go to LA to meet my greatest guru, as in the word teacher. And that would be the man who would become my ex-husband.
Okay. So 17, you left, you'd had enough. So you were aware enough that it was not a healthy family dynamic.
It's very interesting. I have a memory that goes back to 18 months old, and I was in a playpen for way too long, wailing. I could feel the heat and the tears. I could feel my heels bouncing on that plastic pad inside that playpen and the wood slats between my fingertips. And when my cries were finally heard, it was not met with love. And I knew that I was in danger. I knew I wasn't safe. And at 4, I have another very visceral memory that's also in the book. And I also was a truth teller. At 5, my parents had a horrific fight in the middle of the night. Now, this one I slept through. Most of them I was the referee for. Well, interestingly enough, my 3 brothers and sister, they had a very different experience of growing up in that home. My oldest brother has almost complete amnesia. My sister feels she had an idyllic childhood. She almost feels guilty that it was so wonderful for her. And mine is A
Not.
little different than those. I was
And that's
very
actually
awake.
not uncommon, right? That's not uncommon for family dynamics to be like that, where, one kind of gets picked on more than the others.
Yeah. Or remembers it, is awake to it at
Right.
least. And yeah, I could call a spade a spade. My father was in a cast. The window was broken. There was icy winter cold air coming through the room. The white voile curtain was moving in that air. My mother was looking up to the corner of the bedroom away from my father. And I was sitting on the bed, wanting my mommy and daddy to be happy. And my dad is laughing. Oh, I got mad and I punched my arm through the window and broke it. That was kind of dumb, wasn't it? And I just wanted to glue them together to find happiness and love. But I also wanted to escape that room as soon as possible because the energy
Mm-hmm.
was thick
Mm-hmm.
and frightening. And I think that's the difference for an empath going through that experience. An empath, one who is highly sensitive, who can feel the emotions, who can read the feelings,
Mm-hmm.
who's that highly sensitive. It's pretty horrendous. And I wanted to get out. At 10, I was watching Barbara Walters in my basement on my beanbag chair saying, I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to be like Barbara Walters.
Wow. Wow. So you had an old soul in you is what you had too. That sounds like.
It's called me an old fart shaman. I'm like, okay.
Gosh, that's hilarious. Oh gosh. Oh, and I can relate that because when I think back, to my childhood, and I definitely, when I was really young, just remembering this, just feeling like this isn't fair. This isn't fair. Like I knew it wasn't right. I knew it wasn't fair. And I knew I wasn't being heard. But in our little minds, I mean, even as an adult, you try to understand, what happened to us. And we just can't fathom that. So, as children, that's a lot of pressure to put on us. We knew it wasn't right, but we were really helpless. There was nothing we could do. And
I,
that's
I I totally agree, but I knew to the core of my being that I was going to make it out of there and I was
yes.
going to be successful no matter what. And as the days approached when I knew this was coming to an end, I was terrified. Like a lot of us that are abused are. It's like Stockholm syndrome. You're afraid to leave the cage, but
Yeah.
I knew I had to do it. And I envied some of my classmates that were marrying each other and staying behind it. It looked so safe, but I knew I would be dead if I
Yeah.
remained.
I know one thing I did was nobody was stopping my brother from physically abusing me. And that
Mhm.
was really, I mean, I have lots of stories about that, but um, I just remember the last time that he hit me, and it was, of course, completely uncalled for. Um, and I left the house after he hit me, and it was in the evening, and I called my dad, and he was actually mad at me. My dad was actually mad at me because I left the house because I had to get away from this man. And I just remember in that moment, and I even said to my dad, when I turn 18, that's it. If he ever touches me again, I'm calling the police. You won't stop him, but I will. So I knew enough to do that.
We share very similar history. I too have abuse with my oldest brother. I've done so much work around it and confronted him in my mid 20s. And he said, that didn't happen. But if it did, here's why it happened. And I have great love for him. I mean, like I said before, his whole childhood is practically a blackout. So you can understand the kind of trauma that he was
Mm-hmm.
experiencing. And, as I was writing the book, I told my family members I'm writing a book, but I didn't give them information. I thought if they're interested, they'll ask me. And it got pretty heavy when the publisher changed the title. And I thought, what am I going to do? Like, I'm going to have a book come out, Toxic Family, and like not tell my family. And I knew this was my own experience, mine. And it was my own experience to express and tell. And this was not a book that I could write by committee. So I ultimately told my older sister, who I love and adore and has been very helpful to me. And she was stunned. You could hear the silence on the other end of the line. And then she said, we've all had very different experiences growing up in that home. And my oldest brother read the book once it came out. And he called me Lisa, and I did not recognize his voice on the other end of the line. It was small and frightened. He sounded like a boy.
I was going to say, like a little boy.
Yeah. And he said, I had no idea. I wish I would have been a better brother to you. I am so, so sorry. And I am so proud of you for all that you've walked through and that you're telling your story. So that was incredibly healing. And it felt like, okay, that's broken even more of the chain of toxicity, and not just for me.
Right, exactly. That went out like this, like a wave, like a drop in the water, and it goes out. Yes. Right down the lineage.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us are afraid to explore it because we don't want to jiggle those compartments. We don't want to bring the cat out of the bag and dive into it, or we feel financially beholden to the system, or we're not going to be safe, if we tell our story, or we'll be extricated from the community. And what I found is, though it's not the easier, softer way, addressing it, working my way through it, and coming from a place of love, not of a victim. I mean, yeah, I had my cries, I had my sobs, I've screamed in many bags and used the bats appropriately, but I was also able to get to a point to understand, yeah, my brother played his role perfectly. I was delivered into the most appropriate house in the most appropriate position for me to evolve as a human being on this earthly walk, not for the faint of heart. And I think I'll read the small print a little more closely next time I decide to come in.
Be a little choosier about your family.
Could be.
Oh gosh. So, okay. So we got to the point. So you left the house, you went to New York, you created this wonderful career and have had a great career. And then what happened that caused you to decide, I need to write a book? Was it during your healing time that you decided to do this? I mean, what was the process for you?
It was a long time and there was a lot that transpired. But in 2007, an Irish seer said, you have a book to write and it's going to help a lot of people. And I completely kicked that under the nearest carpet. Lisa, I did not want to write a book as a PR tool. Yeah. And in 2020, two intuitives told me the same back to back. And the third intuitive told me, you have 3 books to write. And I thought, okay, before it becomes a library, I better figure this out. But I did go to New York and I did pursue my dreams. I did an arts management internship out of college. I was 19, living in Greenwich Village on my own. And that firm wanted to hire me straight out of college, but I wanted something glitzier. So I went to work for ICM, which is a very large global talent agency. And I learned the business. And the agent that I worked with left to form his own agency. He was matching celebrities to brands. And he invited me to join him. So I went because as an assistant in a large agency, it's very difficult to get any practical experience. Or back then it was, you were kept outside the office while all the business went on behind closed doors. So I knew because we'd be in a studio office suite, I would learn from him. And so off I went and I did learn, but I also learned he had a very serious issue with sexual addiction. And he would invite young women in for their casting moment and excuse me. And one day he tried the same thing on me. And at 7 a.m., I rang Barbara Walters' door. This was the next morning because Barbara had become a personal exercise client of mine. I was training people on the side because I wasn't making enough money working for the agent. She took one look at me. She said, "Susan, get in here. What is going on?" And it had triggered so much trauma from my past.
Oh,
She
yeah.
got it out of me. Yes, she got it out of me so fast. And she was highly intuitive. And she said, "I'm coming to work with you this morning, and we're going to confront this man together."
Yes.
Barbara, I so appreciate you, but I got it covered. I did confront him. I confronted him that day, and he promptly fired me. I had a couple of months cash in the bank. I had just extricated